You know that feeling when you're in the middle of a conversation and, without really trying, you already know where it's going. The person is still explaining, still building the idea step by step. But somewhere inside your mind, the conclusion has already formed. Not just the ending, but the path they're about to take, the examples they'll probably use, even the tone they're going to land on. And in that exact moment, something subtle happens. Your attention starts to fade. Not because you don't care about the person, and not because the conversation has no value, but because your brain has already completed the process before it actually unfolded. So instead of experiencing the conversation in real time, you're sitting there with something that already feels finished, just waiting for reality to catch up with what your mind has already done. This can be confusing, because on the surface it looks like boredom. It feels like you're losing interest too quickly, like you're not as engaged as you should be, especially in conversations that are supposed to matter. But what's actually happening is much more specific than that. It's not disinterest, it's anticipation. When your brain processes information quickly and becomes highly efficient at recognizing patterns, it doesn't just help you understand things faster, it changes how you experience interactions. You begin to pick up on subtle structures in how people communicate, the way they start a thought, how they develop it, how they usually conclude it. And over time, your mind starts predicting these sequences almost automatically. So instead of following the conversation step by step, you start skipping ahead, filling in the gaps before they're fully expressed. And once that happens, the sense of novelty disappears. There's no uncertainty left, no discovery happening in the moment. And without that, your engagement naturally drops. This is why it becomes difficult to stay interested in linear conversations. Not because they're meaningless, but because your brain has already reduced them to something familiar too early. It's like reading a story where you already know every plot point. You can still go through it, but the experience is fundamentally different. The mistake most people make, including you at times, is interpreting this as a lack of interest in people, as if you're becoming distant or disconnected. But that's not what's happening. The issue isn't the people, it's the speed at which your mind processes what's happening between you and them. And when you start to see it this way, something shifts. Because instead of forcing yourself to feel more engaged, you begin to understand why the engagement drops in the first place. It's not that you're uninterested. It's that your brain removes the unknown too early, and without the unknown, there's nothing left to hold your attention in the same way. So that feeling of being slightly ahead, slightly out of sync, isn't a sign that something is wrong with how you connect. It's a sign that your mind is operating at a different pace than the interaction itself. And learning how to deal with that difference is what changes the experience completely. Have you ever noticed how something that should be simple somehow becomes complicated the moment you start thinking about it? Not because the situation itself is complex, but because your mind doesn't stay on the surface. It goes further. It starts unfolding possibilities, exploring variations, projecting outcomes that most people wouldn't even consider. You're not just choosing between options. You're analyzing what each option leads to, what it avoids, what it changes over time. And this all happens almost instantly, but instead of giving you clarity, it creates a kind of mental expansion that makes the decision feel heavier than it actually is. From the outside, this often looks like hesitation, like you're taking too long to decide something that should be obvious. But internally, it doesn't feel like indecision. It feels like you're seeing too much at once. That's the paradox most people don't realize. Higher intelligence doesn't necessarily simplify choices. it multiplies them. Because the more variables your brain can generate, the more scenarios it creates. And once those scenarios exist, it becomes harder to ignore them. Your mind doesn't just pick an option, it simulates it. It runs through possibilities, compares outcomes, evaluates consequences, sometimes even imagining how small differences could lead to completely different results. And while this ability can be extremely useful in complex situations, it creates friction in simple ones. Because simple decisions require limitation. They require you to ignore most variables and just move forward. But your mind resists that. It keeps expanding the field instead of narrowing it. So what looks like delay is actually overprocessing. You're not struggling to choose because you don't know enough. You're struggling because you know too many ways it could go. And over time, this can create a subtle frustration. Not because you lack direction, but because even small decisions start to feel unnecessarily demanding. But once you understand this pattern, something shifts. Because you stop labeling it as indecision. You start seeing it for what it really is. A mind that doesn't reduce possibilities easily, and because of that, sometimes makes simple things feel more complex than they need to be. There's another experience that tends to appear, and it's even harder to explain. Moments where you're in a social environment, everything seems normal, everyone is behaving in a certain way. And yet, something doesn't quite make sense to you. It's not obvious. It's subtle, but it's enough to pull your attention. A rule that feels arbitrary. A reaction that seems inconsistent. A behavior that everyone accepts, but doesn't fully align when you look at it more closely. And while other people move through it without questioning, your mind pauses. Not because you want to challenge anything, but because you naturally look for coherence, for internal logic, for structure that holds together. And when that structure isn't clear, your brain keeps analyzing. Highly analytical minds don't just apply logic to problems, they apply it to systems, including the invisible systems that govern social behavior. But most social systems are not built to be logically perfect. They are built to function. They rely on shared assumptions, emotional agreements, and patterns that people follow without needing to question. So when your mind starts examining those systems, inconsistencies become visible. And once you see them, they don't disappear. This isn't about being rebellious. It's not about wanting to break rules. It's about having a lower tolerance for things that don't fully make sense. But there's a consequence to that awareness. Because the moment you stop fully accepting the system, you stop moving through it automatically. You become aware of it while participating in it. And that creates a distance that's hard to explain. Not a separation from people, but a separation from the structure they're following. You understand what's happening, but it doesn't feel completely natural anymore. And over time, this can create a sense of displacement. Not because you don't want to belong, but because something inside the environment doesn't fully align with how your mind processes it. And the hardest part is that this often goes unnoticed by others, because for them, the system works well enough. But for you, it never feels entirely resolved. And learning how to navigate that, without constantly trying to force yourself to ignore what you see, is what starts to change that experience. Have you ever noticed how the way you judge yourself feels completely different from how you judge other people? You can be patient with others. You can understand their mistakes, consider their limitations, even recognize their effort without demanding perfection. But when it comes to you, the standard changes in a way that's hard to explain. It's not just that you expect more, it's that you see more. You don't only evaluate what you did, you automatically compare it to what you believe you could have done. And that difference becomes almost impossible to ignore. Even when something works, even when the result is objectively good, there's often a quiet sense that it wasn't fully aligned with your potential. Not in an emotional way, but in a structural way. Like you can see the version of the outcome that would have been more precise, more efficient, more complete. And this doesn't come from insecurity in the way most people understand it. It comes from awareness. When your mind is capable of mapping possibilities clearly, it doesn't stop at reality. It constantly references potential. It builds an internal model of what something could have been, and then places your actual result next to it. That's where the tension comes from, because your reference point isn't what happened. It's what was possible. And the more aware you are of your own capacity, the more demanding that internal reference becomes. Not because you're trying to pressure yourself, but because your mind naturally detects the gap. This creates a pattern where achievement doesn't always feel like completion. It feels like partial execution of something that could have gone further. Over time, this can lead to a kind of silent dissatisfaction. Not visible from the outside, because from the outside things may look completely fine. But internally, there's always that sense that something could have been improved. And the difficult part is that this standard keeps moving. It adapts to your growth. It evolves with your understanding. The better you become, the more refined your internal criteria get. So satisfaction becomes temporary. You reach a result, and instead of stabilizing, your mind recalibrates. It updates the standard, adjusts the expectation, and creates a new version of what better looks like. You're not failing to meet a fixed goal. You're measuring yourself against something that is constantly expanding. And if you're not aware of this dynamic, it can feel like you're never doing enough. But when you step back and look at it clearly, you start to see that the problem isn't lack of performance, it's excess of internal criteria. Your mind doesn't allow you to stop at good enough easily, because it can already see what better looks like before you even get there. And once you recognize this pattern, something important shifts. You don't lower your standards, but you stop treating your potential as a permanent obligation. You begin to understand that capacity doesn't have to turn into constant pressure, because the same awareness that pushes you forward can also prevent you from ever feeling finished. There's another pattern that tends to appear, and at first it can feel like inconsistency. You start something new, and it captures your attention almost immediately. There's curiosity, energy, a sense of engagement that feels natural. Your mind becomes focused, absorbed, interested in understanding how it works, how it unfolds, what it can become. And for a while, that engagement is real. But then something shifts, not suddenly but noticeably. The same thing that felt interesting begins to lose intensity. The curiosity fades, the focus weakens, and what once held your attention no longer feels stimulating in the same way. From the outside, this can look like a lack of discipline, like you can't stick with things, like you move on too quickly, like your interest isn't stable. But internally, the experience is different. It's not that you stopped caring. It's that your mind extracted what it needed faster than expected. When something is new, it presents complexity. There are unknowns, patterns to discover, structures to understand, and your brain engages deeply with that. But once those patterns become clear, once the structure is mapped, the level of challenge drops. And with it, the stimulation drops too. Your brain requires a certain level of complexity to stay engaged, not artificially, but naturally. It seeks environments where there is still something to process, something to decode, something that hasn't been fully understood yet. When that disappears, the activity doesn't necessarily lose value, but it loses its ability to hold your attention. And that's where the disengagement begins. This creates cycles that can be difficult to interpret. Periods of intense focus, where you dive deeply into something, followed by periods where that same thing no longer feels compelling. Not because you're unstable, but because your threshold for stimulation is higher. You don't lose interest randomly. You lose interest when your mind no longer feels challenged in a meaningful way. And if you're not aware of this, it's easy to mislabel it, to think you lack consistency, when in reality, your engagement is directly tied to complexity. The problem is that not everything in life maintains that level of complexity over time. Some things become repetitive, predictable, linear, and for most people that's enough. But for your mind, once the pattern is fully understood, staying engaged requires something more. And this is where frustration can build. Because it feels like you're always searching for something that holds your attention in the same way initial curiosity does. But that intensity isn't designed to last forever. It exists to pull you in, to help you understand, to allow your mind to map the structure. After that, the engagement has to shift into something else, and learning how to navigate that transition is what changes everything. Because the issue isn't that you can't stay interested, it's that your interest is driven by depth, not by repetition. And once you recognize that, you stop seeing your patterns as instability. You start seeing them as a reflection of how your mind interacts with complexity. And from there, you gain a different kind of control, not by forcing yourself to feel interested, but by understanding what actually sustains your attention in the first place. Have you ever noticed how, in certain situations, you choose not to say everything you're thinking, even when you know exactly how to express it? It's not hesitation in the usual sense. You're not searching for words. In fact, the opposite is happening. The thought is already clear, structured, ready, but something in you pauses before letting it out. Not because you doubt what you're saying, but because you're already anticipating what happens after you say it. You can sense the shift in the room, the subtle discomfort, the way the conversation might change direction, sometimes even the way people might look at you differently, not in an obvious way, but just enough to be noticed. So instead of pushing that boundary, you adjust. You simplify what you were going to say. You reduce the depth. You take something complex and make it easier to digest, or sometimes you choose not to say it at all. And this doesn't come from insecurity in the way people usually describe it. It comes from awareness. You're reading the environment in real time. You're mapping reactions before they happen. You're calculating the impact of your own expression, not out of fear, but out of precision. You know when something might feel like too much, too detailed, too intense, too different from the level the interaction is operating on. So you adapt. And at first, this seems like a strength. It keeps things smooth. It avoids unnecessary friction. It allows you to move through different environments without creating tension. But over time, something starts to build beneath that adaptation. Because the version of you that is being expressed is not always the full version. It's a filtered version, a calibrated version, one that fits the moment but doesn't always reflect the depth of what you're actually perceiving. And the more often you do this, the more automatic it becomes. Until at some point, It's no longer a choice, it's just how you interact. And that's when a subtle question begins to appear. Not loudly, but consistently. Are you being yourself or just being understood? Because there's a difference between clarity and reduction. Clarity is expressing something deeply in a way that connects. Reduction is holding back parts of it to avoid disconnect. And when reduction becomes the default, something inside starts to feel compressed, not enough to break anything, but enough to create a quiet sense that you're not fully showing up as you are. And recognizing this doesn't mean you stop adapting. It means you become aware of when you're choosing connection and when you're sacrificing expression. Because the ability to read the room is a strength, but constantly shrinking your depth to fit it slowly turns that strength into limitation. And then there's another layer that's even harder to explain. The experience of seeing patterns that other people don't seem to notice at all, not just in abstract ideas, but in everyday situations, in how people behave, in how conversations repeat themselves, in how certain dynamics unfold almost the same way, over and over again. You start to recognize structures beneath the surface, small inconsistencies that point to larger patterns, connections between things that don't seem related at first, but clearly align when you look at them from a different angle. And this doesn't feel like effort. It feels automatic. Your mind naturally organizes information into meaning. It compresses complexity into patterns that make sense internally, even when they're difficult to explain externally. And that's where the tension begins. Because when you try to express what you see, it doesn't always translate. Not because you don't understand it, but because what you're seeing doesn't exist in a simple, linear form. It's layered, it's interconnected. It doesn't unfold step by step in a way that's easy to communicate. So you start trying to explain it. And somewhere in that process, something gets lost. The depth reduces. The clarity fades. The reaction you get doesn't match what you expected. And over time, this creates a quiet frustration, because it feels like you're seeing something clearly, but can't fully share it in a way that others experience it the same way you do. And that gap creates a specific kind of isolation, not physical isolation, but cognitive isolation. You're present, you're interacting, you're part of the environment. But your internal experience isn't fully mirrored. You understand more, but feel understood less. And one of the most common mistakes here is assuming that this ability should always be useful. That if you can see patterns, you should be able to apply them, explain them, or turn them into something practical every time. But that's not how it works. Not every pattern is meant to be expressed. Not every insight is transferable. Some things exist only at the level of perception, and expecting all of it to translate perfectly only increases the frustration. Because the issue isn't your ability to understand, it's the assumption that everything you understand should be easily shared. And once you let go of that expectation, something shifts. You stop measuring the value of your perception by how well others can follow it. You start recognizing that some levels of understanding are internal by nature. And that doesn't make them less real. It just means they operate differently. Because in the end, the weight doesn't come from seeing more. It comes from trying to force that vision into spaces where it doesn't fully fit. And when you stop forcing it, the isolation changes. It doesn't disappear completely, but it becomes something you understand, instead of something you fight against. If this made sense to you, subscribe. This is just the kind of thing most people feel, but never really understand. See you in the next video.